Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of How History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I took you through the life of Joseph Hooker from his birth through the Mexican-American War and his political and business interests on the West Coast. Now I'll move right into the American Civil War. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Join the Patreon page for sneak previews, early releases, and voting on upcoming videos, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Joseph Hooker made it to Washington, D.C. without incident. He immediately went to his political friends and asked them to lobby for him a position in the Union Army. After a meeting with Senator Edward Baker, a longtime friend of Abraham Lincoln, the senator wrote this letter to President Lincoln. Sir, Colonel Joseph Hooker has just arrived from the Pacific Coast and will wait on you in person. He desires to draw his sword for the country. He is an educated soldier. The history of the Mexican War is filled with battles in which he bore distinguished and honorable part. No regular officer of his rank won more renown, and no man of any rank showed more gallantry. His testimonials are of the very highest order. I have known him well, and add mine. You cannot rely too much on his capacity as a soldier and his loyalty as a man. As Hooker remained in Washington, he began to recognize some of his old comrades now commanding large groups of men in the Union Army. Men like Ambrose Burnside and William T. Sherman, who had been subordinate to him in the old army, were now in command of brigades. When he arrived on the East Coast, Hooker lobbied for a command of a regiment, but with renewed confidence in his own ability, he began to seek out a higher command, thinking that if his old subordinates commanded brigades, he was at least entitled to that size of command. When his state of Massachusetts offered him a command of one of the regiments, he turned it down, hoping to get a larger command. Hooker followed the throng of people following the Union Army to watch the Battle of Bull Run take place. It can be assumed that he observed the Union defeat with a critical eye and returned to Washington, seeking out his old superior, George Cadwalader. He introduced Hooker to Abraham Lincoln, introducing him as Captain Hooker. Lincoln greeted him, then turned to speak to others. Hooker spoke up and said, "Mr. President, I was introduced to you as Captain Hooker. I am, or was, Lieutenant Colonel Hooker of the regular army. When this war broke out, I was at home in California and hastened to make a tender of my services to the government, but my relation to General Scott or some other impediment stands in the way, and I now see no chance of making my military knowledge and experience useful. I am about to return, but before going I was anxious to pay my respects to you, sir, and to express my wish for your personal welfare and for your success in putting down the rebellion. And while I'm about it, Mr. President, I want to say one more thing, and that is that I was at the Battle of Bull Run the other day, and it is neither vanity or boasting in me to declare that I am a sight better general than you, sir, had on that field." Lincoln grabbed Hooker by the hand and sat down with him. After talking, Lincoln rose, put his hand on Hooker's shoulder, and said, "Colonel, not Lieutenant Colonel Hooker, stay. I have use for you and a regiment for you to command." Lincoln commented later, "His eye was steady and clear, his manner not half so confident as his words, and altogether he had the air of a man of sense and intelligence, who thoroughly believed in himself and who would at least try to make his words good." On August 3rd, Hooker's nomination by Congress was confirmed. He was to be a brigadier general of volunteers. Although it was signed off on August 3rd, his rank was backdated to May 17, 1861, along with a host of other brigadier generals, which would bring about difficulties in the future. Hooker became the 32nd highest-ranking general in the Army by September. He took command of a brigade in the Army organized by George B. McClellan. The brigade was made up of the 1st and 11th Massachusetts, the 2nd New Hampshire, and the 28th Pennsylvania. Hooker established Camp Union to the northeast of the city to watch the approaches from Baltimore. In September, the 1st Michigan joined the brigade, and by October, Hooker was elevated to division command, commanding his brigade and another brigade under Daniel Sickles, as well as some cavalry and an artillery battery. Also in October, Hooker and his division would be sent on a mission, minus the 1st Michigan, which was removed from the division, to the lower Potomac River to guard against Confederate incursions. Rebels and Southern sympathizers from Maryland were attempting to smuggle supplies from Maryland into Virginia via ferries and boats across the river south of Washington, and Hooker was named to stop it. With around 10,000 men, he set up telegraphic communications with McClellan, built warehouses, and prepared defenses against a possible Confederate attack. Hooker was strict with the discipline of his division, making sure that they were properly drilled and the camps were kept clean. His division possessed a low rate of hospitalizations due to Hooker's cleanliness of camps. An aeronautics station was built where Hooker employed a balloon to observe the enemy's works. Although he was skeptical at first, he quickly saw the value after a thorough map was constructed of the Virginia side of the river. In November, the division grew by another brigade, one containing the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th New Jersey Infantry Regiments. The men delayed setting up winter quarters because they heard rumors that they would be sent to Charleston, South Carolina, or further south, but the cold weather soon set in, and the men were forced to build huts to protect them. The Potomac River soon froze over, which prevented supplies from getting to the division. Hooker used the 3rd Indiana Cavalry to patrol the water's edge and sniff out boats carrying the mail between Baltimore and Richmond. Try as they might, Hooker never could put a permanent end to the mail getting through. The rebels found all kinds of ways to sneak down to the river and get across it. The Hoosiers even used small boats to further patrol the water's edge, getting the nickname from Hooker as the Horse Marines. Runaway slaves were a huge issue for Hooker. He was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. When his superior, McClellan, ordered officers to return runaway slaves to their owners, Hooker didn't follow that to the letter. He did give permission to slave owners to come into camp and search for their slaves. At the same time McClellan was urging officers to return slaves, Congress made it a penal offense for officers to surrender fugitive slaves. When the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War looked into the matter, Hooker remarked, "What the hell do they expect an officer to do?" If Hooker disobeyed orders, he faced a court-martial. If he obeyed them, he faced retribution from Congress. It was a lose-lose. Again, Hooker was anti-slavery, and his permitting of slave owners into the camp wasn't completely supportive of the owners. When some men came into camp stating that their slaves were in the Massachusetts camp and demanded McClellan's orders to be followed, Hooker replied, "Yes, I have seen the order, and yonder is the Massachusetts camp, and if your slaves are there and choose to go with you, and the Massachusetts boys are content, I have no objections. But if they refuse, and a row occurs over there, I fear you will get into the guardhouse, the same as any other marauders." The slave owners asked, "But General Hooker, are you not going to apprehend our slaves for us?" Hooker replied, "Why, bless my soul, no. I am a brigadier general, United States Volunteers, and no slave catcher. I was born and bred in New England." All wasn't pleasant in the division, especially at the brigade level of command. When Hooker was raised to division command, that left his spot vacant in the brigade. The successor thought too highly of himself and butted heads with Hooker on multiple occasions. His other brigade commander, Daniel Sickles, couldn't get his brigadier general status confirmed by Congress because he was a Democrat and the Republican Party didn't want him to have such a position. The 3rd Brigade also lacked a brigadier general. Colonel Samuel H. Starr of the 5th New Jersey commanded the brigade while the division was in Maryland. By the latter part of January 1862, Hooker's repeated urging at launching an attack on the Confederate battery emplacements on the Virginia side of the river got approved. Lincoln made February 22nd the day for a general advance by all Union armies. McClellan had been planning an advance, but this urging by Lincoln confounded his own plan. Nevertheless, he approved of Hooker making the attack. When the day for the assault across the river came, a multitude of problems began to arise. By February 15th, the planned day of attack, the necessary boats hadn't arrived. McClellan offered him an ironclad steamer and an additional 10,000 to 15,000 more men. By February 27th, Hooker received a wire from McClellan stating to make no further advancements. McClellan's chief of engineers told the commanding general that it would take 3 divisions of infantry and that McClellan himself should lead the group. He also made the comment that the landing point was too hazardous. The attack was called off, and Hooker's dreams of making an impactful attack in the war dematerialized. In early March, the Confederates evacuated their position in a chorus of explosions and black smoke. They destroyed all that couldn't be brought with them. Some of Hooker's men moved across the river and raised their colors over the abandoned rebel works. Soon the Army of the Potomac would be divided into 4 corps. Hooker's division was put in the 3rd Corps under Samuel Heintzelman. McClellan received approval of his plan to land on the peninsula in Virginia formed by the York and James rivers and proceed to Richmond. It took nearly a month for every soldier to be transported to the peninsula, and Hooker's division was one of the last scheduled units to make the journey. On the peninsula, the 3rd Corps and Hooker were on the extreme right of the Union line near Yorktown. McClellan ordered trenches and fortifications built, and Hooker's men began the grueling work in the wet weather. It became such hard work that the Army issued extra whiskey rations to those doing the work. Unfortunately for them, the officers, through whom the rations passed through, filled their own canteens with whiskey and diluted what was left with water so that the men got their correct ration. The privates quickly found out what had happened, and one private from New Hampshire approached Hooker with a dipper of liquor. He asked Hooker to take a swig of the whiskey, and when he did, Hooker spit it out and threw the dipper into the brush. Cursing those who ruined his troops' rations, Hooker made sure the spirits went directly through his headquarters so he could supervise the rations to the privates. McClellan's siege at Yorktown resulted in giving the Confederacy about a month to concentrate forces against him. When the Confederates began to withdraw up the peninsula toward Richmond, the Union Army gave chase, and Hooker was among some of the commanders in front. Hooker chased the rebels all the way to a fortification called Fort Magruder. Since Hooker was out front and away from many of his superiors, he saw this as his opportunity to utilize his aggressive style and not be held back by timid superiors. He began to form his division for an attack on the fort, but before he could launch an attack, the Confederates sallied forth and made their own assault. The battle began to rage, and Hooker's men were holding on, but it was a desperate struggle, as it seemed the Confederates kept renewing their attacks with new troops. Hooker, as would become a custom, sat on his horse next to his men, instilling confidence in them and boosting morale. At one point, his horse was hit by a bullet. Hooker dismounted, examined the wound, then remounted. When one of his batteries approached the battle, Hooker asked where it was going. To the front, came the reply. Hooker exclaimed, "My God, there is no front. Can you go into battery here?" When the cannons with double canister went off, Hooker's horse reared and fell back on him. Uninjured, Hooker remounted and continued to try and stabilize his line. His men began to run out of ammunition and were beginning to withdraw. Hooker helped organize a steady withdrawal with the help of his artillery and kept the Confederates at bay. Philip Kearny, recently given command of the 3rd Division of the 3rd Corps, brought his men up and was told to take orders from Hooker. After putting one brigade into the fight, Kearny and Hooker came together, and Kearny said, "I think I rank you." Hooker replied, "Certainly, General, you do." The battle came to an end, and Hooker took his men behind the lines and had them build fires to warm themselves. In the reports filed by McClellan about the battle, he left out Hooker and Kearny's attacks and focused mainly on the battle in Winfield Scott Hancock's front. After seeing the reports, Hooker looked at Lieutenant Colonel Mott of the 5th New Jersey and said, "Mott, it seems to me you and I and your Jersey Blues and the Excelsior Brigade were not at Williamsburg at all. Hancock did the business." About the same time, Hooker wrote a letter to his friend, Senator James Nesmith, about McClellan. He is not only not a soldier, but he does not know what soldiership is. He is no more of a man than McDowell. Later he wrote, "McClellan is an infant among soldiers. Form no opinion of what you read in the newspapers. They and the wires are under McClellan's control, hence the flattery, etc. The blazoning about the bayonet charge of Hancock is all stuff." For his part in the Battle of Williamsburg, Hooker got his nickname, but not in the traditional way. A typesetter for a New York newspaper put together a column for the paper and entitled it, "Fighting Joe Hooker." From then on, he retained the name Fightin' Joe Hooker. However, there is some controversy as to how the nickname came about. One of his biographers explained, "This account of the derivation of his nickname has been the accepted story, and it is supported by a wealth of detail concerning the incident, but it is still not altogether satisfactory. The typesetter involved purportedly worked for the New York Courier and Enquirer, but by 1862, this paper had been swallowed up by the New York World. The sobriquet does not appear in any issue of the World immediately after the Battle of Williamsburg or any other battle on the peninsula. Fightin' Joe does not appear in common usage for 4 months after Williamsburg. A reasonable conclusion is that in some spontaneous manner it was applied to Hooker after Williamsburg, and was revived popularly as his aggressive leadership guided his command into one desperate fight after another. Hooker reached out to the press writing, "Don't call me Fightin' Joe, for that name has done and is doing me incalculable injury. It makes a portion of the public think that I am a hot-headed, furious young fellow, accustomed to making furious and needless dashes at the enemy. Nevertheless, the name stuck. Once Hooker's division recovered and the Army of the Potomac began their push westward toward the capital at Richmond, Hooker and his men followed, taking up a position on the Union left, south of the Chickahominy River. As it stood, 2/5 of the Union Army were south of the river, with the rest north of it, presenting a precarious situation if one was attacked. Hooker was stationed at Poplar Hill. When the Confederate Army under Joseph E. Johnston took advantage of the separation of McClellan's force, it resulted in the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. Rebel mismanagement resulted in the attacks falling apart, and Union reinforcements halted the attacks further. On the morning of June 2nd, Hooker led part of his division toward a counterattack, which held the rebels in check. During the battle, one good story of Hooker's personality came out. When 2 New Jersey regiments came to a swamp in their advance, Hooker was in the lead. A soldier told him that no one could get through the swamp. Hooker, in dashing fashion, replied, "Get out of the way. I have 2 regiments here that can go anywhere." In late June, Hooker and another division of Heintzelman's corps was to advance their pickets and then their battle lines. When given the command to move, the division moved out, Hooker keeping an eye on his line. They battled and pushed back rebel defenders, and the day seemed to be going well. Then a telegram came from McClellan ordering the commanders to pull their men back to their starting position. Both Heintzelman and Hooker were astonished at the order. The advance was going so well, but if they stopped, they would lose all their momentum. Puzzled, but following orders, they halted. When McClellan arrived on the field and was told of the success, he ordered them to continue, but it didn't meet the previous success. The Battle of Oak Grove ended, with not much in the way of change in the battle lines. The day after the Battle of Oak Grove, the Battle of Mechanicsville opened. Miscommunication and mismanagement on the Confederacy's part led to the Union inflicting heavy casualties on the rebels. McClellan sent a telegram to Hooker on the left of the line telling the division commander to tell his men, "Porter's whipped 'em on the right." When Fitzjohn Porter and his corps retreated so soon after the battle, the men of Hooker's division began to welcome any good news with, "Porter's whipped 'em on the right." The 7 days battle bluffed McClellan into pulling back down the peninsula. When Hooker and his fellow division commander Kearny got the message, they fumed and went to see McClellan. One of Hooker's biographers described the meeting. In haste, they rode over to McClellan's headquarters, where Kearny insisted on being permitted to march into Richmond and at least rescue the 14,000 prisoners there, returning if he could not hold on. Hooker, who was Kearny's junior in rashness as well as rank, agreed that this could be done, but suggested that another division should go along as support. Heintzelman also lent his voice to the proposal, but McClellan coldly refused. Kearny then gave the commanding general as thorough a verbal beating as was possible, short of inciting a court-martial. As the army pulled back, Hooker helped guard the rear. At the Battle of Glendale, or Frazier's Farm, he wasn't directly engaged, but did send a brigade of men to help push back a Confederate breakthrough. Even though it wasn't his most impressive feat of the war, it got him some of the most attention he had received from the commanding general. The army continued to pull back and form at a place called Malvern Hill. Most of the fighting took place on the left of the Union line, away from Hooker, but he did send Daniel Sickles' brigade to throw back a Confederate attack on the Union left flank. Other than that, the division did very little fighting. However, a newspaper correspondent stuck with Hooker's division, and needing a good story, wrote a fabricated piece for his paper stating that the fate of the Army of the Potomac depended on Hooker and his division. This further boosted Hooker in the minds of the Northern public, who read the story and knew no difference. The Army of the Potomac continued their withdrawal down the peninsula, and during this time McClellan informed Hooker that he was being looked at considerably for the command of a corps. Hooker's ambition soared, and he began to write somewhat favorably of McClellan during this time. Hooker wrote to a friend in the Senate that, if these officers are still to be imposed upon McClellan, God help him in this army. I will sooner dig potatoes or cut down trees than belong to any army in which all these officers exercise commands. If I cannot be placed upon the same footing of other officers of the army, the sooner I quit it, the better. I will not fight their battles for them with the doors to promotion closed on me. In late July, promotion came for both Hooker and his friend Kearny, raising them to the rank of Major General of Volunteers. Hooker celebrated, and the chief commissary for the division placed 200 candles in the branches of the trees surrounding headquarters. The sight was said to be surpassingly beautiful. In early August, McClellan ordered Hooker's division and John Sedgwick's division to push west and capture Malvern Hill. Hooker did so, and it caused the new commander of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, to dispatch troops to deal with Hooker. But Hooker got an order to withdraw before a major battle at Malvern Hill could happen for a second time. Lincoln and the Secretary of War felt that the Peninsula Campaign had been a failure and ordered McClellan to move his men off the peninsula and transport them to Aquia Creek, where they would be added to the growing Army of Virginia under General John Pope, fresh from his campaigns in the Western Theater. On August 21st, Hooker and his division departed the peninsula on their way to Northern Virginia. Hooker left the area having gained high honors for his actions and gained the confidence of his men. One member of the division wrote, "Hooker was always present on the field, alert and vigilant, conspicuously mounted on a white horse, with flashing eyes, florid face, and high shirt collar, that soon wilted down when we got engaged, but as cool and collected under fire as if directing a parade or a picnic. He always seemed to know exactly what to do and when to do it."